When I talk about democratic socialism, I'm not looking at Venezuela. I'm not looking at Cuba. I'm looking at countries like Denmark and Sweden.
Get the fuck out of here.
Hey, what's up everyone? This is Ramiro with Anticonquista. Anticonquista is an anti-imperialist media collective. Our content is produced by and for the Latin American and Caribbean diaspora. And welcome to episode 10 of Decolonizing Media. Decolonizing Media is a video podcast dedicated to exposing capitalist and imperialist ideology in mainstream media, especially when we're talking about Latin America, the Caribbean, and socialism. So today we're talking about none other than Bernie Sanders. Bernie is a self-described democratic socialist who's the current junior senator of Vermont and who's running to become president in 2020. He's registered as an independent, but he's seeking the Democratic Party nomination. During the last U.S. presidential election in 2016, Bernie faced off against former First Lady, Secretary of State, and New York State Senator Hillary Clinton, an imperialist warmonger who many see as representative of the Democratic Party establishment. A lot of people thought he would get the Democratic nomination in 2016 since he won 23 primaries and caucuses and about 46% of pledged delegates to Hillary's 54%. But by July 2016, Bernie conceded to Hillary and formally endorsed her campaign against Donald Trump, who of course ended up winning. A lot of people, especially Bernie supporters, were upset by the move and said the cards were stacked against him, especially because leaked emails from the Democratic National Committee showed that the party's elites, like Representative Debbie Wasserman Schultz, preferred Hillary and rigged the DNC in her favor. Meanwhile, he urged his supporters to vote for Hillary, but continue what he described as the political revolution. But as all of us know, by the end of it, Hillary lost to Trump and the Democrats were left divided. Now, Bernie is once again seeking the Democratic Party nomination for the upcoming 2020 presidential election, competing against 23 other candidates. Some of his top policy platforms include Medicare for all, free public college, and a $15 per hour minimum wage. For those outside of the U.S., Medicare for All would establish a universal single-payer healthcare system, kind of like what Canada and a lot of Western European countries have now. Bernie has also called for expanding the current real estate tax, and his plan is to tax estates starting at $3.5 million, with a 77% rate on billionaire estates. Also, he wants to cap the size of top financial institutions and break up big banks like JP Morgan Chase and Goldman Sachs. All of these policy platforms are part of Bernie's vision of what he calls democratic socialism. When speaking about what democratic socialism means to him in 2015, Bernie said, quote, "I don't believe government should take over the grocery store down the street or own the means of production. But I do believe that the middle class and working families who produce the wealth of America deserve a decent standard of living and that their incomes should go up, not down. I do believe in private companies that thrive and invest and grow in America, companies that create jobs here rather than companies that are shutting down in America and increasing their profits by exploiting low-wage labor abroad." With this definition in mind, can we really call Bernie Sanders a socialist? What is socialism? What's the difference between socialism and what he calls democratic socialism? But before answering these questions, I just quickly want to share a video with you all produced by MSNBC where Bernie offers his definition of what he calls democratic socialism. And I think this will give you a better sense of why he makes that distinction.
When I talk about democratic socialism, you know what I'm talking about? Social Security, one of the most popular and important programs in this country, developed by FDR to give dignity and security to seniors. And it has been enormously successful in reducing poverty among seniors. When I talk about democratic socialism, I am talking about Medicare, a single-payer healthcare system for the elderly. And in my view, we should expand that concept to all people. I believe that everybody in this country should be entitled to health care as a right, and the most effective way to do it is through a Medicare for all single-payer program. When I talk about democratic socialism, I'm not looking at Venezuela. I'm not looking at Cuba. I'm looking at countries like Denmark and Sweden. And you know what goes on in those countries? All of the kids who have the ability and desire go to college. And you know how much it costs? It is free. They have child care systems which are outstanding. They have public educational systems which are extremely strong. The retirement benefits for their elderly, much better than they are in the United States.
So in the video we just played, Bernie said, quote, "When I talk about democratic socialism, I'm not looking at Venezuela. I'm not looking at Cuba. I'm looking at countries like Denmark and Sweden. In other words, I'm a racist piece of shit who doesn't care about black and brown people in the global south," is what he's saying. This quote from Bernie is a perfect example of why he's definitely not a socialist and is in fact a social imperialist. A social imperialist, as Russian revolutionary Vladimir Lenin once put it, is someone who is socialist in words and imperialist in deeds. A social imperialist who is most often than not white and European is someone who supports progressive social policies and economic policies at home while continuing imperialist policies abroad. And when we're talking about imperialist policies abroad, we're not just talking about wars and invasions. We're talking about the parasitic economic exploitation of the third world, known as the global south, by the first world, which is also known as the global north. My good friend and fellow co-editor of Anticonquista, Carlos Cruz, exposed the role of Scandinavian countries like Denmark and Sweden in global imperialism in an article published in Telesur English. In the article, he pointed out that in 2008, Norwegian communications multinational Telenor, which is partly owned by the state, was exposed for partnering with a Bangladeshi supplier that employed child labor in inhumane conditions. We're talking about kids as young as 7 years old working 12 hours a day, making pennies by the hour. Meanwhile, G4S, the world's largest security company, which has been involved in the murders of labor activists in the third world in countries like Indonesia, comes from Denmark. And Sweden, another so-called socialist Scandinavian country, which Bernie didn't mention, is home to major military-industrial complex companies like Saab, BAE Systems, and Bofors. Companies like these, which are supported by the Swedish government, sell weapons and spy technology to over 50 countries around the world and rake in billions of dollars annually. And you've got H&M, another Swedish company, which has sweatshops in Asian countries like Myanmar, Cambodia, and Bangladesh. When I visited Bangladesh in 2014, I personally got to speak with a sweatshop worker who told me how bad working conditions were there. And I've seen that poverty with my own eyes. It's really something that's infuriating. So don't come and tell us that social imperialist countries like Denmark and Sweden are democratic socialist countries while you talk shit about our people in the global south who are actually building real forms of socialism that aren't based on exploitation. Sure, socialism in Venezuela and Cuba is not perfect and it has its flaws. But socialism is a process, and they are in the process of building socialism and constructing true socialism, one that isn't based on the plunder of poor people around the world. Also, Bernie conflates expanded welfare programs and higher taxes on the rich with socialism, which means something totally different. We'll go into that in a second. But lastly, I just wanted to add that by qualifying socialism with the term democratic, he makes it seem as if socialism is not already democratic at its root, when in fact, socialist revolutions across the world have been some of the most radically democratic movements in human history. And this is probably surprising to a lot of you who were born and raised in the US, like myself, because we've been brainwashed for generations into associating socialism with dictatorship and capitalism with democracy. I used to make this mistake myself all the time, but as you study and learn more, you see why that's false. A true socialist understanding of democracy and dictatorship are much more advanced than this shitty version, honestly, being espoused by Bernie. So I want to take a deeper dive into the theoretical foundations of socialism, its practical application throughout history, and why the social imperialist views promoted by Bernie are far from socialism. So what exactly is socialism? In order for us to understand what socialism is, we first have to understand what capitalism is, because socialism is directly opposed to all that capitalism stands for. Much of our understanding of capitalism comes from German philosopher and revolutionary Karl Marx, who published his groundbreaking work Capital in 1867. His unfinished 3-volume series is a thorough look at the inner workings of capitalism. Capitalism can be defined as an economic and political system in which the means of production are controlled by a small group of wealthy private owners for capital or profit. Whenever we use the term means of production, we're talking about the facilities, resources, and tools used for producing goods in society. We're talking about factories, robots, laboratories, schools, natural resources, transportation systems. In other words, the technological wealth of society, or the means of production, are used for the accumulation of capital by private owners. Under capitalism, profits determine how society is organized. Capitalists invest money into industries where they know they can make even more capital or profit. Profits are then extracted from the exploited labor of workers who produce more value than they take home. Although capitalists have to spend money on wages and raw materials, they ultimately make more money than what they started with at the beginning of the day because of something called surplus value, which is where capital is accumulated. Surplus value is the difference between the amount raised through a sale of a product and the amount it costs the owner of that product to manufacture it. In other words, the amount raised through the sale of the product minus the cost of the materials, plant, and labor power. Let's take the example of a shoe company. Suppose a shoe company in the U.S. spends $50 on wages, rent, and raw materials every hour to produce one pair of shoes. If the company is able to sell the pair of shoes for $80, they make a profit of $30 an hour. So even though the workers produced a commodity that is worth $80, they only get to keep a fraction of that wealth that they created, while the capitalist keeps the profit and reinvests it so that they can accumulate even more capital later on. And the cycle goes on and on and on. This is surplus value. This is the foundation of capitalism. And this exploitation of labor under capitalism gets worse once markets expand internationally. Let's go back to the example of the shoe company. If the cost of paying for wages and raw materials in the U.S. goes up, the capitalists will then turn to oppress third world nations for more profit, since the goal of capitalism is to accumulate more wealth. Let's say the company decides to move to Haiti, and now they spend $30 on wages and raw materials every hour instead of the $50 that they spent in the US. If they're able to sell the same pair of shoes for $80, they now make a profit of $50 instead of the $30 that they made in the US. This is how globally capitalism makes a smaller group of people wealthier and a larger group of people poor. The vast majority of the wealthy live in the first world, Europe, North America, and Japan, while the vast majority of the poor live in the third world, Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Under capitalism, the 26 richest people on Earth in 2018 had the same net worth as the poorest half of the world's population, some 3.8 billion people, and that's according to Oxfam. Also, 42 million people, or 0.8% of the world's population, have net worths in excess of $1 million. That group, the global 1%, controls 44.8% of the world's wealth. That's some crazy shit. That's capitalism in a nutshell, is inequality. Now, as workers around the world make less money because they're forced to compete with each other, they're unable to purchase the same products they produce as consumers. This creates a situation where the shoe company, for example, is unable to sell their shoes because no one has enough money to buy them. Thus, their profits steadily decline and economic crisis begins. Marx referred to this as the falling rate of profit. And because of this, we're put in a situation where a company is producing too many shoes that millions of barefoot people are unable to buy because they have no money. A similar thing happens in the housing market when you have more unsold and empty homes than there are homeless people. Because markets are not rationally planned under capitalism according to human need, irrational phenomena like more homes than homeless people and more shoes than barefoot people becomes something that's very common. Marx also referred to this as the anarchy of production under capitalism. Capitalists, also known as the bourgeoisie, live off stolen value produced by workers known as the proletariat, who overwhelmingly make up the majority of the world's population. Other characteristics of capitalism include private property, wage labor, and competitive markets. In our current era of capitalism, imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, Lenin talks about monopoly stage of capitalism, where you have a few number of companies ruling the global market. And that's the current era that we're in now, the capitalist imperialist era. Socialism, on the other hand, is an economic and political system in which the means of production are controlled by workers, who form the majority of the world's population. Under socialism, human needs determine how society's wealth is created and distributed. Products are not created for the purpose of accumulating capital from exploited value for a small group of people. Instead, products are created because the majority of people are hungry, in need of housing, in need of education, or in need of food. Under socialism, the people who were most exploited by the capitalist system take the reins of society by any means necessary. Workers, peasants, women, black people, indigenous people, LGBTQ people, and especially people in the global south. Everyone who's gotten the short end of the stick under capitalism rules under socialism. Under socialism, labor is respected and society operates under the principle from each according to their abilities to each according to their needs. Understanding that the wealthy capitalist class won't easily give up its privileged position, socialists call for the forceful overthrow of their system, including their state. After all, working within the political systems created by capitalists won't result in any success because it's designed to benefit the interests of the ruling class. Ultimately, socialism is a transitory stage towards communism, which Marx and many others envision as a stateless and classless society. But until communism can be reached, socialism must be built, and it's a process that can take decades, if not centuries. During this time, the working class ushers in what's called the dictatorship of the proletariat, or workers. Workers are the proletariat. Simply put, this means that among the working class, decisions are made directly and democratically. The workers exercise a dictatorship over the capitalists, who are no longer in charge and take direct orders from the proletariat. This dictatorship is needed because, once again, the only way to take control from the capitalists is through direct force. Socialists, especially third worldists and anti-imperialist socialists like us at Anticonquista, argue that there must be a global redistribution of wealth under socialism. Capitalism is a global system that has historically benefited first world nations. Thus, the poor masses of the third world must be central to the redistribution of wealth. Let's not forget that the wealth of European and North American countries was based directly on the colonization of Africa, Latin America, and Asia. People, land, and resources were directly exploited and tossed aside to create all of the wealth that we see in cities like New York, Paris, and London. Ultimately, whenever we talk about socialism worldwide, building socialism, we have to take all 7 billion people on the planet under consideration. That's just fact. And that doesn't mean that we limit our analysis to the 327 million people who live in the United States. And we also have to talk about reparations for third world people, Black people, indigenous people, people in the Middle East, who have been the hardest hit by capitalism and imperialism. And on all these points, you can see how Bernie Sanders fails to agree with any of them. He has not said anything about reparations for people in the global South. He supports imperialist maneuvers in the Middle East. He supported the U.S. presence in the Middle East against Syria. He also defended keeping troops in Afghanistan. And he hasn't talked about the global inequality that's created by U.S. finance capital. And even his methods of building what he calls socialism in the U.S. don't take into account this concept of dictatorship of the proletariat, which is so central to socialism. The fact that the workers and oppressed have to come together and forcefully take over the government and get rid of the bourgeoisie without their permission in order to take back the levers of state power. This is so essential to socialism, and it's something that Bernie Sanders has never once mentioned in his platforms. And he can't do that because he's representing a bourgeois party, the Democratic Party, which represents the interests of coastal bourgeois elites. So we can see, based on this criteria of socialism, that the platforms Bernie Sanders is putting forward is very far from that. So to conclude, Bernie Sanders is definitely, absolutely not a socialist. Bernie Sanders is a social imperialist, someone who wants better social programs for people in the United States at the expense of oppressed workers and peasants in the global South. Not only does he talk shit about Black and brown people in the third world who are in the process of building real socialism despite centuries of colonization and capitalist poverty, he also totally misconstrues the true meaning of socialism by equating it with white capitalist countries connected to the global imperialist system that have some progressive domestic policies. He doesn't seek to overturn the capitalist imperialist system imposed on the world by the United States as any true socialist would. He seeks to create a kinder and gentler form of capitalism that maintains the living standards of the first world at the expense of the third world. Some refer to Bernie as a Keynesian liberal or a New Dealer to describe his political and economic views, referring to John Maynard Keynes, a British economist who supported government intervention, and the New Deal of Franklin Delano Roosevelt during the 20th century. In my opinion, though, these terms don't go far enough in explaining what he truly represents, and that's why I prefer to describe him as a white social imperialist. At the beginning of the episode, I played a clip where Bernie said, quote, "When I talk about democratic socialism, I'm not looking at Venezuela and Cuba. I'm looking at countries like Denmark and Sweden." In reality, the opposite is true. If you want to truly understand socialism, look to the oppressed countries of the third world, where the people have nothing to lose but their chains, where the people have been most exploited by the capitalist and imperialist system. Sure, it's not perfect and it's not fully where it needs to be, like as I mentioned before with Venezuela. But it's a lot better than what these old dusty white people in Europe and North America, like Bernie Sanders, are promoting. A lot better. So that's all for today. Thanks for listening and watching. This was episode 10 of Decolonizing Media on Anticonquista. Anticonquista is an anti-imperialist media collective. All of our content is produced by and for the Latin American and Caribbean diaspora. Make sure to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and IG at Anticonquista. Subscribe to us on YouTube, youtube.com/Anticonquista. And you can listen to the audio version of this podcast on SoundCloud, soundcloud.com/Anticonquista. Thanks again, and we hope to hear from you soon.